Scales rippled with nervous energy as he entered the massive lecture hall. The room could hold 500 cadets, and today every seat was filled. This was the class everyone talked about in whispers, the class that changed careers, the class that half the students failed. The instructor stood at the front, her battle-scarred carapace telling stories of 3 wars. Battle Master H was a legend at the Galactic Strategic Institute. She had survived the Terminus campaign, and earned more honors than most officers collected in 2 lifetimes. Now she taught the strangest course in the entire academy. Terran Warfare, Principles of Tactical Impossibility. Settled into his seat, his 4 eyes scanning the room, cadets from a dozen species filled the hall. Like himself, tall warriors, crystalline, even a few thick-shelled exchange students. All of them were here for the same reason. The Galactic Coalition had made this course mandatory 5 years ago, after the Outer Rim campaigns proved that traditional doctrine was no longer enough. H touched her control pad and the lights dimmed. A hologram filled the air above her head. "Tell me what you see," she said. Studied the image. It showed a primitive battlefield covered in mud. Creatures in metal armor sat on 4-legged beasts, thousands of them, arranged in perfect lines. Across from them, a much smaller group of bipedal figures stood in loose formation, holding what looked like curved wooden sticks. "A losing battle," someone called out. "An execution," another cadet added. H's mouth parts clicked in what had learned was amusement. This is the battle of fought on Earth in the year 1415 by their calendar. The larger force you see consisted of approximately 30,000 French knights and men at arms, heavily armored, mounted on war horses. The nobility of an entire nation, equipped with the finest weapons their world could produce. She gestured to the smaller group. The English force numbered perhaps 6,000. They had been marching for weeks. Disease had killed hundreds. They were starving, exhausted, and armed primarily with longbows, wooden bows that fired wooden arrows. Felt confusion ripple through his neural cluster. Then the battle was over before it began. "Watch," H activated the simulation. The French knights charged across the muddy field. Their armor gleamed even in the dim light. They looked unstoppable, but the English didn't run. They stood their ground and released their arrows. Thousands of arrows, darkening the sky like a swarm of insects. The arrows fell on the charging knights. Horses screamed and fell. Armored warriors tumbled into the mud. The charge slowed, then stopped, then became a confused mess of struggling bodies. The English kept shooting. The French knights, trapped in their heavy armor in the thick mud, couldn't advance and couldn't retreat. For 6 hours, the slaughter continued. When the hologram ended, the smaller force had won. The larger force had been destroyed. "Impossible," a cadet breathed. "Tactics," H corrected. The humans chose their battlefield carefully. They knew the rain would turn the field to mud. They knew heavy cavalry would struggle. They knew their longbows had the range to strike before the enemy could close. They transformed every disadvantage into a weapon. She pulled up another battle, then another. Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans held a narrow pass against hundreds of thousands. Cannae, where Hannibal surrounded a larger Roman force using pure tactical genius. Where Napoleon baited his enemies into a trap by pretending to be weak. With each battle felt his understanding of warfare shift. The humans were primitives in these recordings. No energy weapons, no shields, no faster-than-light travel, just biological bodies and simple tools. Yet they won battles they should have lost, again and again and again. "Every species in this room comes from a military tradition," H said. "The value honor and direct combat, the prefer overwhelming force, the use precision and calculation, the believe in perfect coordination, all valid approaches, all tested over millions of years." She paused, "and all of them inadequate against an enemy that refuses to fight the way you expect." The lecture hall was completely silent now. Humans don't have one military tradition. They have thousands. They studied war the way my species studies mathematics. They tested every possible approach to killing each other, refined those approaches, wrote them down, and taught them to the next generation. For 10,000 years, they did nothing but fight wars and learn from them. H brought up a new image. This one was recent, only 20 years old. It showed a human warship, small by coalition standards, facing a. The ship was called the TCSS Defiance. The First Contact War, whispered. Every cadet learned about humanity's introduction to galactic society. They had attacked a human colony world, expecting easy prey. They found something very different. The Defiance was a destroyer, H said. Crew of 140. She encountered of 17 warships while evacuating civilians from the colony of New Terra. Standard doctrine says a destroyer cannot engage a. Standard doctrine says you retreat and call for reinforcements. The hologram showed what happened instead. The Defiance attacked. For 6 days, the small human ship fought the entire. She used every asteroid, every debris field, every gravity well in the system as a weapon. She fired, moved, fired again, never staying still long enough to be destroyed. She targeted sensor arrays and communication relays, blinding the ships and preventing their perfect coordination. She vented atmosphere to fake critical damage, then ambushed pursuing vessels. The tactics were insane, suicidal. No rational commander would attempt them. They worked. For 6 days, the Defiance held this attention while 40,000 civilians evacuated. By the end, the human ship was a floating wreck. Life support was failing. The hull had been breached in 20 places. 80% of the crew was dead or dying. The captain, a woman named Elizabeth, broadcast a message on all frequencies as her ship finally began to break apart. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, she recited. All in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward, the light brigade. Charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. The Defiance exploded 3 seconds later, but by then, coalition reinforcements had arrived. The civilians were safe. The damaged and confused by 6 days of impossible combat was driven off. What was she saying? A cadet asked quietly. A poem, H said, written by a human named about a cavalry charge that failed catastrophically. 600 soldiers rode into certain death because of a miscommunication. Most of them died. The poem honors their courage, even in a doomed charge. Felt his scales prickle. She was dying. She knew her ship was destroyed. Why recite poetry about a failed battle? Because to humans, courage matters more than victory. Because they believe some battles are worth fighting even when you know you'll lose. Because Captain wanted them to understand that humanity would never surrender, never give up, never stop fighting no matter the odds. H's voice carried a strange emotion couldn't identify. They retreated from human space after the First Contact War. They had superior numbers, superior technology, superior logistics. They won nearly every battle. But they lost the war because they couldn't break human will. The lecture hall remained silent as H shut down the hologram. This is why you're here, she said. Every military academy in the coalition now teaches human warfare. Not because humans are the strongest species, not because their weapons are the best, but because they understand something about war that we forgot or perhaps never knew. War is not mathematics. War is not about resources and calculations and acceptable losses. War is chaos, and the species that embraces chaos, that refuses to be bound by rational doctrine, that fights with creativity and audacity and sheer stubborn will, that species wins. Left the lecture hall that day with his world turned upside down. He had trained his entire life to be a warrior. He had studied tactics, strategy, logistics, leadership. He had memorized the 12 principles of warfare passed down for 100,000 years. Now he wondered if everything he knew was wrong. The humans had been part of the Galactic Coalition for only 20 years. They were newcomers, primitives who had barely mastered faster-than-light travel when they stumbled onto the galactic stage. Yet every major military power in the galaxy now required their officers to study human history. 47 different species had rewritten their tactical manuals based on human principles. Because humanity's battles, fought with primitive weapons on a single small world, contained more military wisdom than 10,000 years of galactic warfare. Returned to his quarters that night and accessed the Academy database. He pulled up every human battle he could find. He read about Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Khan, Napoleon, Lee. He read about Thermopylae, Cannae, Hastings, Waterloo, Gettysburg, Stalingrad, Midway, Normandy. He read about guerrilla warfare, siege warfare, naval warfare, air warfare, armored warfare. The humans had a saying, quantity has a quality all its own. But they also proved, again and again, that quality and creativity could overcome quantity, that the side that should lose could win if it refused to accept defeat, that impossible was just another word for difficult. By the time finally slept, the first sun was rising over the academy. His mind churned with new ideas, new possibilities, new ways of thinking about warfare that violated everything he'd been taught. He didn't know it yet, but 6 months later, those ideas would save his life and the lives of everyone he served with. Because war was coming to the coalition, and the enemy they would face wouldn't fight by any rules the galaxy understood. Only human rules would be enough. The war games began 3 months into the term. Every cadet at the Galactic Strategic Institute knew these simulations could make or break a career. Top performers received their choice of postings. Poor performers found themselves assigned to cargo haulers in empty sectors. Had been chosen to lead a defensive task force. The scenario was based on a human battle called Midway, fought on Earth's oceans during something called World War II. He commanded a carrier group protecting a critical refueling station against an invasion force twice his size. The briefing was clear. Hold the station for 72 simulated hours until reinforcements arrived. His instructors watched from an observation deck, their scoring tablets ready. 15 other cadet teams faced similar scenarios simultaneously, each one testing different aspects of command under pressure. Studied his forces carefully. 3 carriers, 8 cruisers, 12 destroyers, and various support ships. His opponent, played by the Academy's tactical computer, commanded 6 carriers, 14 cruisers, and 24 destroyers. The numbers weren't encouraging, but had trained for this his entire life. He deployed his forces according to standard doctrine. Defensive perimeter around the station, overlapping fields of fire, layered sensor coverage. Cruisers positioned to support the carriers. Destroyers screening against fast attack craft. Everything by the manual, every ship in its proper place. The simulation began. Within 6 hours, was losing badly. The computer's forces probed his defenses, found weak points, exploited them ruthlessly. When he moved ships to reinforce one sector, the enemy attacked another. His careful defensive positions became static targets. The computer predicted his movements because he followed doctrine, and doctrine was predictable. At hour 6, he had lost 3 destroyers and 1 carrier. The station's shields were at 40%. His fleet's morale index was dropping as casualties mounted. At hour 7, Battlemaster H stopped the simulation. Adequate performance, she announced his team. The word adequate felt like a blade to his pride. You followed standard defensive protocols. You made no major errors. You also made no progress. Against a superior force, adequate performance equals slow defeat. She reset the simulation and addressed the entire room of cadets. I'm offering one team the opportunity to try something different. You'll face the same scenario, same odds, but you'll employ what we call human doctrine, the principles you've been learning in lectures. Who volunteers? Silence filled the room. Knew why. Human doctrine was risky, unpredictable, often suicidal. It violated every principle of rational warfare taught by every species in the coalition. Finally, a cadet named raised his massive hand. "My team volunteers." The other cadets murmured. Some looked at with pity. His team was being called the Death Squad before the simulation even restarted. H nodded. "Cadet, your team will play the defending force again. Follow standard doctrine as before. His team will face you using human doctrine. Let's see what happens." The simulation reset. Once again commanded the defensive task force. This time commanded the attacking fleet. Same numbers, same ships, same scenario. But everything went differently. His fleet didn't advance in formation. Instead, it split into 6 separate groups that moved in unpredictable patterns. Some groups raced forward aggressively. Others hung back. One group headed away from the battle entirely, as if retreating. Frowned at his tactical display. The enemy's formation made no sense. They had broken their mutual support. He could destroy those scattered groups one at a time if he moved quickly. He dispatched 3 destroyers to engage the nearest enemy group. The enemy group fled. Destroyers pursued, leaving their defensive positions. That's when 2 other enemy groups appeared from behind a nearby asteroid field and struck's weakened flank. "How did they get there?" demanded. "His sensors should have detected them." "They went dark," his tactical officer reported. "Shut down all emissions, used only passive sensors." That was insane. Ships running dark couldn't coordinate effectively. They were vulnerable, blind. Standard doctrine said you never went dark during fleet operations. But it had worked. Lost 2 cruisers before he could respond. He pulled his forces back into a defensive formation. Scattered groups suddenly coordinated, hitting his fleet from 4 directions simultaneously. When moved ships to respond to one threat, another threat emerged. The enemy wasn't trying to win through superior force. They were trying to make him react, keeping him off balance, never letting him settle into a stable defensive posture. At hour 8 realized he was fighting blind. He knew where the enemy ships were, but he had no idea what they would do next. They violated every pattern, broke every rule. One enemy carrier deliberately drew fire while its strike craft launched from an unexpected vector. An enemy destroyer rammed one of his cruisers, sacrificing itself but taking out a ship worth 3 times as much. That was the moment understood. Wasn't trying to minimize losses. He was trying to maximize confusion. He was making respond to him instead of executing his own plan. Every decision made was reactive, defensive, playing into his hands. At hour 10, his command ship took a crippling hit. His communications went down for critical minutes. When they came back up, the battle had shifted completely. His forces had seized the initiative so thoroughly that his fleet was just trying to survive. At hour 12, the simulation ended. Had won despite being outnumbered. Had lost despite following perfect doctrine. The observation deck was silent as Battlemaster H replayed key moments. She highlighted decisions where had followed the manual and had broken it. Every time did what he was supposed to do, punished him for being predictable. "This is the core lesson of human warfare," H said. "Initiative matters more than numbers. Unpredictability matters more than perfect formation. Making your enemy react to you matters more than having the better defensive position." She pulled up historical human battles. Hannibal at Cannae, using a weak center to draw in the Romans before crushing them from the sides. Napoleon at pretending to be weak to lure his enemies into a trap. His race across France, moving so fast the Germans couldn't establish defensive lines. Each battle showed the same principle. The side that seized initiative and forced the enemy to react usually won, regardless of numbers. "Humans have a phrase," H continued. "The best defense is a good offense, but that's not quite right. The truth is deeper. The best defense is to make your enemy so confused, so off balance, so busy reacting to your actions that they can't execute their own plans. Defense isn't about building walls. It's about making the enemy fight your battle instead of theirs. Scales burned with embarrassment but also with understanding. He had been thinking about warfare wrong his entire life. The way of war emphasized honor, strength, direct confrontation. Meet the enemy head-on and prove your superiority. But humans didn't care about proving anything. They cared about winning. And winning meant being willing to do things your enemy thought were crazy. Over the next weeks, the cadets ran dozens more simulations. Sometimes they played defensively using standard doctrine. Sometimes they attacked using human doctrine. The results were consistent. Human doctrine won more often, especially against superior numbers, because it transformed war from a mathematical problem into an art form. Learned to split his forces even when it seemed suicidal. He learned to feint, to bluff, to sacrifice pawns for position. He learned that ships running dark and using asteroid fields for cover could appear exactly where the enemy didn't expect them. He learned that sometimes the right move was to ignore the valuable target and hit something the enemy thought was safe. Most importantly, he learned to be unpredictable. Humans had studied deception for thousands of years. They developed an entire field called game theory about predicting and manipulating opponent behavior. They wrote books on psychological warfare. They understood that battles weren't just fought with weapons, they were fought with minds. The Academy's human liaison officer, commander, gave a guest lecture near the end of the term. He was a short biped with dark skin and graying hair, unimpressive physically, but carrying himself with quiet confidence. People ask me what makes human warfare different, said. The answer is simple. We accept that war is chaos. Most species try to impose order on chaos. They create doctrines and formations and procedures to make war predictable and manageable. Humans do the opposite. We embrace chaos. We add to it. We make the battle so confusing, so unpredictable, so chaotic that our enemies can't function. He smiled. There's a saying from an ancient human general named Mike. Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. That's human doctrine in one sentence. We punch our enemies in the mouth, break their plans, and then keep punching while they're trying to figure out what happened. The cadets laughed, but heard the truth beneath the humor. Humans had refined chaos into a weapon. They studied every form of warfare, learned from every defeat, incorporated every lesson. By the time they reached the stars, they had 10,000 years of military experience compressed into their tactical manuals. The final exam was another simulation, this time without warning. Arrived at the academy one morning to find alarms blaring. He was assigned a ship, given a crew of fellow cadets, and told to respond to an enemy incursion. No time to plan, no time to prepare, just react. His ship was a light cruiser, fast but lightly armed. The enemy force consisted of 3 heavy cruisers bearing down on a civilian transport. Standard doctrine said should call for backup and keep his distance. He was outnumbered and remembered Captain and the Defiance, remembered and Midway and 100 other battles where humans faced impossible odds. He didn't call for backup. He attacked. His cruiser raced straight at the enemy formation at maximum speed, firing wildly, broadcasting false telemetry, suggesting his shields were stronger than they were. The enemy cruisers broke formation, uncertain whether this was a suicide run or the vanguard of a larger force. In that moment of confusion, ship screamed past them and positioned itself between the enemy and the civilian transport. Then he stopped, dead in space, daring them to attack. The enemy cruisers hesitated. Ship was cornered, but it was also in the perfect position to damage them if they approached. They would win, but at what cost? Standard doctrine said to use their numbers, surround him, destroy him methodically. That's when launched all his attack craft at once, dozens of small fighters spreading out in every direction. Most were empty drones running on automated programs, but the enemy didn't know that. They saw what looked like a coordinated strike from multiple vectors. The enemy cruisers scattered to defend themselves. The civilian transport jumped to FTL and escaped. Ship, its mission complete, fled while the enemy was still confused. The simulation ended. Battlemaster H appeared on his, her mandibles clicking in approval. "You passed, Ensign." Blinked Ensign. "You graduated. That was your final exam. You saved the civilians using tactics that would have gotten you expelled 3 months ago." H's eyes glittered. "You learned to think like a human, to fight like one. That's what we needed you to learn." 6 months later, stood on the bridge of the Coalition warship Infinite Reach as a junior officer. He had graduated with honors. He had his choice of postings and chose a cruiser because that's where he could make a difference. He had no idea that in 3 days, everything he learned at the academy would be tested in real combat against an enemy that shouldn't exist. The Devourers were coming. The alarm screamed through the Infinite Reach at 3:47 ship time, rolled out of his bunk and raced toward the bridge, his training taking over before his mind fully woke. The corridors filled with crew members rushing to battle stations. He reached the bridge in 90 seconds. "Report," Captain ordered. The elderly commander stood at the center of the bridge, calm despite the chaos. "Multiple contacts emerging from FTL," the sensor officer said. Her voice carried an edge of fear. "Configuration unknown. Energy signatures match nothing in the database, designating them hostile based on weapons lock." Took his position at the tactical station and pulled up the data. What he saw made his scales go cold. 17 ships had appeared at the edge of the system. They were organic-looking things, all curves and irregular surfaces, more like living creatures than machines. The energy readings were wrong, the propulsion was wrong, everything about them was wrong. "Devourers," Captain breathed. "But that's impossible. They went extinct 8,000 years ago." The Devourers were legends, nightmare stories told to cadets. A hive-minded species that had nearly conquered the galaxy before the ancient coalition destroyed them. Every individual was part of a collective intelligence. They coordinated perfectly, never hesitated, never feared. The ancient record said fighting them was like fighting a single massive creature that happened to have thousands of bodies. No one had seen a devourer in 8, until now. Coalition fleet responding, communications reported. All ships moving to defensive formation. Watched the tactical display. 60 coalition vessels representing a dozen species formed up in proper defensive posture, overlapping fields of fire, cruisers protecting carriers, destroyers screening, everything by the manual exactly as it should be. The Devourers attacked. They moved like nothing had ever seen. Perfect coordination, but not predictable. They flowed around the coalition formation like water, hitting weak points before they even became weak. When coalition ships moved to defend one area, the Devourers were already attacking another. They traded ships for position without hesitation, willing to lose 10 vessels if it meant destroying one coalition carrier. Within an hour, the coalition fleet was in chaos. 15 ships destroyed, 20 more damaged. The Devourers fought with absolute efficiency and zero fear. They didn't care about their own losses. They didn't retreat when damaged. They just kept coming, coordinated perfectly, exploiting every opening. Captain was shouting orders, trying to rally the fleet, but standard doctrine had no answer for this. The coalition forces were falling back, formations breaking, command structure fragmenting. That's when the bridge took a direct hit. The explosion threw across the room. He hit the wall hard enough to crack his carapace. Emergency lighting flickered on. Through the smoke, he saw Captain's broken body. The entire command crew was dead or dying. He was senior surviving officer. Pulled himself to his feet, agony shooting through his left side. The Infinite Reach was crippled, life support failing, weapons offline, engines at 15%. The ship was dead, it just hadn't stopped moving yet. Around him, what remained of the Coalition fleet was dying. The Devourers were winning through sheer relentlessness. They didn't have better weapons or shields. They just never stopped, never hesitated, never made mistakes. Perfect hive coordination against imperfect individual species. Standard doctrine said should order evacuation. Get the crew to escape pods, die cleanly. It was the rational choice. Thought about the defiance. About every human battle where logic said surrender and humans said attack. All hands, he said into the ship-wide comm. His voice was steady despite the pain. This is acting, Captain. We're going to do something insane. We're going to charge directly into the center of the enemy formation. Silence on the bridge. Then the surviving officers began to move. Start broadcasting false telemetry, ordered. Make it look like our reactor is going critical. Make them think we're about to explode. It was a bluff straight out of human poker theory. Had studied deception tactics in his tactical psychology course. Humans had developed lying into an art form, using it in everything from card games to warfare. The Infinite Reach limped forward on failing engines, heading straight into the mass of Devourer ships. Screw broadcast sensor data showing reactor fluctuations, power spikes, all the signatures of an imminent catastrophic failure. The Devourers hesitated. For the first time in the battle, the perfect hive coordination broke. Individual Devourer ships began moving away from the Infinite Reach, calculating that staying close to an exploding ship was inefficient. They scattered just slightly, prioritizing survival over attack. All escape pods, ordered. Program random trajectories, delayed activation, make it look like reinforcements jumping in. The human military manuals discuss the importance of creating multiple dilemmas. Don't give your enemy one problem to solve. Give them 5 problems simultaneously. Paralyze them with too many decisions. Escape pods launched in every direction, their drives programmed to activate at random intervals. On sensors, it looked like multiple ships arriving via micro-jumps, a reinforcement wave hitting from every vector. The Devourers scattered further. In that moment of hive confusion, saw something he hadn't expected. The Coalition fleet, inspired by the Infinite Reach's suicidal charge, was reforming. A commander broke from defensive formation and led her ships in a slashing attack on an exposed Devourer flank. A cruiser squadron executed a human tactic called crossing the T, positioning themselves to hit enemy ships from an angle where they couldn't return fire effectively. The battle transformed. Coalition ships stopped fighting defensively and started attacking. They spread out, hit from multiple angles, used asteroids for cover, employed every unconventional tactic the Academy taught. They stopped trying to minimize losses and started trying to maximize enemy confusion. The Devourer's perfect coordination became a liability. They were evolved to fight rationally, efficiently, logically. They had no answer for chaos, for unpredictability, for enemies that did things that made no logical sense. The hive intelligence couldn't adapt fast enough. It had millions of years of perfect coordination, but humans had 10,000 years of studying deception, chaos, and impossible victories. 3 hours later, the Devourers retreated. They had won every tactical engagement, destroyed more ships, inflicted more casualties. But they couldn't break the Coalition's will. And will, as humans had proven throughout their history, mattered more than logic. Sat in the ruins of the Infinite Reach's bridge as damage control teams worked around him. Medical officers had stabilized his injuries. The ship was hulked, but her crew had survived. Battlemaster H appeared on the one working, broadcasting from Coalition Command. Her mandibles clicked in what now recognized as deep satisfaction. 17 battles across 7 systems, she said. 17 Coalition victories. Do you know what they all had in common? New officers who abandoned standard doctrine. Officers who learned to fight like humans, H corrected. The Devourers are everything the ancient records said: perfect coordination, fearless, efficient. They should have destroyed us, but they evolved to fight logical enemies. We gave them chaos instead. She paused. You're being promoted to full captain and assigned to the academy as an instructor. Your performance will be studied for generations. You saved not just your crew, but the entire sector fleet, because you had the courage to do something suicidal. Looked at the ruined bridge around him, at the scorch marks and the dead. War wasn't glorious. It wasn't beautiful. Humans knew that better than anyone, had written about it for thousands of years. But they also knew that some things were worth fighting for, even when logic said you couldn't win. Especially when logic said you couldn't win. 3 months later, stood before a lecture hall full of cadets at the Galactic Strategic Institute. His carapace had healed, but the scars remained. He wore them like the honors they were. "Tell me what you see," he said, activating a hologram of the Battle of. The cadets studied the image, outnumbered English-facing French knights. "A losing battle," one cadet said. Scales rippled in amusement. "Let me tell you about winning." For the next hour, he walked them through human military history. Not just the tactics, but the philosophy behind them. The willingness to embrace chaos. The refusal to accept defeat. The understanding that war was about breaking the enemy's will, not just destroying their ships. He ended with a quote from a human general named George S., projecting the words on the screen behind him. "No poor bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making the other poor bastard die for his country." The cadets shifted uncomfortably, not yet understanding. But they would learn, had learned. H had learned. The entire coalition was learning. Because in a galaxy of logical warfare, humanity had taught them something more valuable than military science. They taught them military art. And art, unlike science, didn't follow rules. It broke them. Looked out at the young cadets, seeing himself 6 months ago. They thought they knew what warfare was. They thought it was about mathematics and resources and following doctrine. They were wrong. And by the time they graduated, they would understand why humans, the species in the coalition, the primitives who had barely reached the stars, were now teaching military excellence to races that had waged war for 1,000,000 years. Not because humans were stronger, not because their weapons were better, but because 10,000 years of constant warfare on one small world had taught them something the galaxy had forgotten. Victory doesn't go to the side that follows the rules best. Victory goes to the side that knows which rules to break, when to break them, and how to make their enemies fight the wrong battle in the wrong way at the wrong time. That was the human gift to the galaxy. Not weapons or tactics or ships, but the understanding that impossible was just another word for difficult. And difficult just meant you had to be creative. The lecture ended. The cadets filed out, their minds churning with new ideas. Watched them go, wondering which of them would one day stand on a ruined bridge and make the choice to charge into certain death rather than surrender. Wondering which of them would learn, as he had learned, that humanity's greatest export wasn't technology or weapons. It was audacity. And in a logical galaxy, audacity was the most powerful weapon of all.